The Shadow Man showed up again last night. I woke around 3 in the morning with that familiar weight pressing down on my chest, the kind that makes breathing feel like work. He'd been standing in the corner of my bedroom just outside the reach of the streetlight coming through my blinds. Same as always, tall, impossibly thin, wearing what looked like torn fatigues that moved without any wind. His face stayed hidden in shadow, but I could feel him watching me. I'd learned not to move when he appeared. Movement seemed to make him step closer, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. So I lay there, counting my breaths until the alarm went off at 6 and he faded back into whatever corner of my mind he'd crawled out of. Dr. Hawkins would call it a hypnagogic hallucination, stress response, PTSD manifestation. She had a dozen clinical terms for what I saw, and they all boiled down to the same thing: my brain playing tricks on me. The mind processes trauma in complex ways, Clifford, she'd told me during our session last week, adjusting those rectangular glasses she always wore. These visions are your psyche's attempt to externalize internal conflict. Her office felt too clean, too bright. Everything arranged just so. The diplomas on the wall, the box of tissues positioned within easy reach, the soft lighting that was supposed to make me feel comfortable but mostly just reminded me how different this place was from anywhere I'd been in the last decade. Nova meant well. I knew that. But she'd never seen the things I'd seen, never felt that particular kind of wrongness that settled into your bones and refused to leave. It's been 6 months since I started coming here, I'd said, watching her scribble notes in that leather portfolio she always kept balanced on her knee. Shouldn't they be getting better by now? Recovery isn't linear. These episodes may continue for some time, but they will diminish as you process the underlying trauma. Process, diminish. Clinical words for something that felt anything but clinical when it was happening. I'd nodded and made the appropriate responses, scheduled my next appointment, paid the copay. But driving home, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. The Shadow Man didn't feel like a memory or a symbol or whatever else her textbook said he should be. He felt real, present, like something that had followed me back from Fallujah and was still following me now. My accounting job helped, mostly because it kept my mind occupied with numbers that added up the same way every time. Predictable, reliable, the kind of order that felt like a luxury after years of chaos. I'd been working at Patterson & Associates for 8 months now, long enough that the other accountants had stopped trying to make small talk about my military service. They'd figured out I wasn't the type to swap war stories over coffee, and I appreciated that. The office sat in a strip mall between a nail salon and a sandwich shop, nothing fancy but clean and quiet. My desk faced the window, which let me keep an eye on the parking lot. Old habits. I spent most of my time reviewing expense reports and tax documents, work that required enough focus to keep the darker thoughts at bay but wasn't so demanding that I couldn't handle it when the nightmares left me running on 3 hours of sleep. This morning felt different, though, heavier somehow. The Shadow Man's visit had lasted longer than usual, and I'd caught myself checking the corners of the office more often than normal. Just quick glances, nothing that would draw attention, but enough to confirm I was alone. The drive to work took me along Route 16, a stretch of 2-lane highway that cut through patches of forest and farmland. I liked the routine of it. Same route, same time, same classic rock station playing songs I'd heard 1,000 times before. My truck, a 10-year-old Ford that ran better than it looked, handled the curves with the kind of familiarity that comes from repetition. The fog had rolled in thick that morning, turning the world gray and muffled. Not unusual for October, but dense enough that I had to slow down and flip on my headlights. The radio played something by Springsteen while I navigated the winding road, my hands steady on the wheel despite the lack of sleep. That's when I saw him. A figure walking along the shoulder, barely visible through the fog. At first, just another pedestrian, the kind you might see anywhere. But something about his movement caught my attention. The way he carried himself, shoulders straight despite an obvious limp. Military bearing, even in distress. I slowed the truck, squinting through the windshield. The man wore what looked like military-style clothing, though it was hard to tell much else through the fog. He stumbled slightly, caught himself, kept walking. No bag, no jacket despite the cold. Just walking down Route 16 like he had somewhere important to be. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder about 50 feet ahead of him and put the truck in park. Something about the situation felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on what. Maybe it was the way he moved, or the fact that we were miles from the nearest town. Maybe it was just instinct. The man kept walking toward my truck, and as he got closer, details started coming into focus. Dark hair, matted and unkempt. Pale skin with an unhealthy tinge. Clothes that had seen better days, a lot better days. But it was his eyes that made my stomach drop. Wild, darting eyes that kept checking the shadows, the kind of hypervigilance I recognized because I saw it in the mirror every morning. I got out of the truck and approached him slowly, hands visible. "Hey there, you okay?" He stopped walking and looked at me, really looked, like he was trying to place my face. Up close, I could see just how bad off he was. Underweight, probably by 40 pounds or more. Small scars on his hands and face, the kind of haunted expression that comes from seeing too much. "I know you," he said, his voice rough like he hadn't used it in a while. That's when it hit me. The facial structure, the way he held his head slightly tilted to the left. Features that had been fuller once, healthier, but were definitely familiar. "Larry?" The name came out barely above a whisper. Larry Lane. Specialist Larry Lane, who'd served under my command in Fallujah, who'd been listed as missing in action after our convoy got hit, who I'd been told was almost certainly dead. Larry Lane, standing on Route 16 in the fog, looking like he'd just walked out of hell. I helped Larry into the passenger seat of my truck, watching his hands shake as he gripped the door handle. The tremors weren't from cold. The night was warm enough, but from something deeper. His fingers looked like bird bones wrapped in tissue paper, the kind of thin you see in people who've been surviving on scraps for months. Maybe years. The way he moved reminded me of wounded animals I'd seen in combat zones, all twitchy awareness and barely contained panic. "You need a hospital," I said, starting the engine. "No." The word came out sharp, almost violent. "No hospitals, no doctors, no records." I pulled back onto Route 16, keeping my speed steady. The fog had started to lift, but Larry still flinched every time shadows moved past the windows. His breathing sounded shallow, like his lungs had forgotten how to work properly. "Larry, what happened to you?" He turned to look at me, then really look, and I saw recognition flicker across his gaunt features. But there was something else there too. Relief mixed with terror, like seeing me confirmed both his best hopes and worst fears. "Sir, I've been gone for 3 years. The words hit me wrong at first. 3 years, that didn't make sense. Our unit got hit outside Baghdad, yes, but that was... I did the math quickly in my head. October 2004. Jesus, it really had been 3 years. I wasn't dead. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I wish I had been. Something cold settled in my stomach. The kind of cold that spreads when you realize the thing you've been trying to forget is about to drag you back down into it. I'd spent 3 years telling myself that night in Baghdad was just combat trauma. My brain trying to make sense of chaos by inventing impossible explanations. But looking at Larry now, really looking at him, I knew I'd been lying to myself. The memories came back in pieces, like fragments of a broken mirror cutting their way to the surface. I'd been asleep in my bunk when the screaming started. Not gunfire or explosions, screaming. Pure animal terror echoing through our temporary base. I'd grabbed my weapon and run toward the sound, but the corridors felt wrong somehow, like they'd stretched longer in the darkness. Private Rodriguez had been first. I found his bunk empty, sheets still warm, but no sign of struggle. No blood, no disturbed equipment. Just gone. Then Private Johnson vanished from the latrine. Then Corporal Williams disappeared from his guard post, rifle still in position, cigarette still burning in the ashtray beside him. One by one we lost them, each disappearance more impossible than the last. Men didn't just vanish from a secured military base, not without leaving traces, not without explanations, but they did. I'd tried to organize search parties, but the remaining soldiers moved like sleepwalkers, their eyes unfocused and distant. Some of them spoke in whispers about shadows that moved wrong, about darkness that felt alive, about something watching from corners that shouldn't exist. "You remember that night," Larry said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "The investigators came a week later," I managed. "Gregory Munoz and his team, they spent 3 days going through everything." "What did they conclude?" "Insurgent attack." The words tasted bitter. "Coordinated assault using unknown tactics. They said the missing soldiers were probably taken prisoner and executed off-site." Larry made a sound that might have been laughter if it hadn't been so broken. "No evidence of insurgents, though. No shell casings, no IED residue, no vehicle tracks, nothing." He was right. Munoz and his investigators had turned our base inside out, looking for proof of enemy action. They'd found nothing. No breaches in perimeter security, no signs of forced entry, no trace of outside interference. Just empty bunks and missing men. "They needed an explanation that fit their reports," I said. "Supernatural abductions don't look good in official files." The deaths of Frankie May and Marcus Rojas still visited me in nightmares. I'd found their bodies in the supply tent, both of them sitting upright against crates of MREs like they'd just stopped to rest. But their faces... God, their faces, eyes wide open, mouths stretched in silent screams, every muscle frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Like they'd seen something so horrifying their hearts had simply stopped. The medics called it cardiac arrest brought on by extreme psychological trauma. Combat stress reaction, they wrote in their reports. But I'd seen plenty of soldiers crack under pressure, and it never looked like that. Never left them looking like they'd gazed into hell itself. "Frankie and Marcus," I said. "What really happened to them?" Larry's hands started shaking harder. He pressed them against his knees, trying to stop the tremors, but they only got worse. "They saw it first," he whispered. "The Shadow Man. It came for them while they were doing inventory. I heard them screaming from 3 tents away, but by the time I got there..." He swallowed hard. "It wasn't an insurgent attack, sir. It was never insurgents." My mouth went dry. The Shadow Man. The same entity that had been haunting my dreams for 3 years, standing in corners and watching me sleep. I'd convinced myself it was PTSD, trauma manifesting as visual hallucinations, but if Larry was talking about the same thing... "What is it?" I asked. "I don't know what it is, but I know what it does." Larry turned to stare out the windshield, his reflection ghostly in the glass. "It doesn't kill you quick like bullets or bombs. It takes you somewhere else, somewhere dark, and it keeps you there." The temperature in the truck seemed to drop 10 degrees. I could see my breath fogging slightly, but the heater was running full blast. "You weren't killed that night," I said, understanding starting to creep in. "You were taken. Me and Rowan Wong. It grabbed us last after the others were gone. Dragged us through... I don't know how to describe it, like falling through a hole in the world." I remembered Rowan. Stocky guy with red hair and a Boston accent, always cracking jokes to keep morale up. He'd been on perimeter watch when he vanished. We'd found his rifle and radio exactly where they should be, but Rowan himself had simply disappeared. Where did it take you? Larry's breathing became more labored, like the memory was physically choking him. Nowhere. Everywhere. A place that isn't a place. Just darkness that goes on forever and cold that gets into your bones and never leaves. The Shadow Man kept us there, fed on our fear. Every day it would show us things, memories twisted into nightmares, visions of everyone we'd ever loved dying in horrible ways. It wanted us terrified, always terrified. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. This was insane. I should be driving Larry to the nearest psychiatric facility, not sitting here listening to stories about interdimensional kidnapping. But everything he said aligned with my own impossible memories of that night. The wrongness I'd felt, the shadows that moved independently of light sources, the way reality itself seemed to bend around whatever was hunting us. How long were you there? Time doesn't work the same way in that place. Could have been days or decades, but I knew somehow that 3 years had passed here. The Shadow Man made sure I knew. It liked showing me how the world kept turning while I was gone, how people stopped looking for me. The cruelty of that detail made my stomach turn. Not just physical imprisonment, but psychological torture designed to break hope itself. How did you escape? Larry leaned forward, his voice becoming urgent. There was a weakness in the barrier. Something disrupted the Shadow Man's control for just a few seconds. A power outage at some abandoned factory in Detroit. I could feel it like a crack in a wall. The darkness flickered, and I ran toward the crack before it could close again. He paused, his whole body trembling now. I fell through and landed in the factory basement. Concrete floor, broken glass everywhere, machines covered in rust and decay. But it was real. It was our world. I'd never been so happy to feel pain. He touched his left shoulder, where I could see a dark stain on his torn shirt that looked like dried blood. Pain meant I was back in a world where things made sense, where cause and effect still worked. In that other place, the Shadow Man could make you feel anything it wanted. Fire that burned without heat, cold that froze without ice, pain that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. I tried to process what he was telling me. An interdimensional prison where physical laws didn't apply, ruled by an entity that fed on human terror. It sounded like something out of a horror novel, but the way Larry described it, the specific details, the genuine trauma in his voice, made it impossible to dismiss. What about Rowan? I asked. Larry's face crumpled. He's still there, still trapped. The crack wasn't big enough for both of us, and God help me, I left him behind. I could hear him calling my name as the darkness closed up again. The guilt in his voice was devastating. Survivor's guilt multiplied by the knowledge that his friend was still suffering somewhere beyond reach. I'd carried my own version of that burden for 3 years, wondering if I could have done something different to save the men under my command. You couldn't have saved him, I said. Not if there was only one way out. I keep telling myself that, but I can still hear his voice echoing in that place. The Shadow Man probably uses it against him now, plays recordings of me abandoning him over and over again. Larry wiped his nose with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of blood. His sinuses looked raw, like he'd been breathing toxic air for months. The factory where you came through, I said. Do you remember anything else about it? Detroit's east side, near the river. Big industrial building, looked like it used to make car parts or something. Most of the windows were broken and there was graffiti everywhere. The power outage happened around midnight. I could see streetlights going dark in a wave across the neighborhood. He closed his eyes, concentrating on the memory. The basement had this electrical panel that was sparking and smoking. That's where the crack appeared, right next to all those blown circuits. Like the disruption in power somehow disrupted whatever barrier keeps that place separate from ours. I filed that information away. If Larry was telling the truth and every instinct I had said he was, then we might have found a way to track this thing. Power outages, electrical disruptions, places where the normal flow of energy got interrupted. The Shadow Man, I said. What does it actually look like? Larry went very still. For a moment I thought he wasn't going to answer, but then he started talking in a voice so quiet I had to strain to hear him. It changes. Sometimes it looks almost human, just taller and thinner than anyone should be. Other times it's just an absence shaped like a person. Darkness so complete it hurts to look at directly. But the worst is when it tries to look familiar. His hands clenched into fists. It would wear the faces of people from home. My mother, my girlfriend, guys from our unit. But the eyes were always wrong, empty, like looking into holes in the world, and when it spoke, he shuddered. It knew things, personal things, memories I'd never shared with anyone. The description matched my own encounters with the entity, the way it seemed to pull information directly from my mind and use it against me. But Larry had experienced years of that psychological warfare while I'd only gotten glimpses during my nightmares. How did you survive it? Mentally, I mean. I almost didn't. There were times I begged it to just kill me and be done with it. But Rowan kept me going. We looked out for each other, reminded each other who we really were when the Shadow Man tried to make us forget. Without him, Larry trailed off, lost in memory. He saved my sanity, sir, and I left him there to face it alone. The weight of that confession hung between us like a physical presence. I wanted to offer some comfort, but what could I possibly say? That everything would be okay? That we'd find a way to rescue Rowan? I didn't even know if that was possible. Instead, I focused on practical concerns. Larry needed food, medical attention, and somewhere safe to recover, but more than that, he needed someone who believed his story. Someone who wouldn't try to convince him it had all been a hallucination brought on by combat stress. "Where have you been since you escaped?" I asked. "Hiding. Moving from place to place. I was afraid it would come after me, try to drag me back. And I was right to be afraid. It found me twice. Once in Cleveland, once in Columbus. Both times I barely got away." My blood went cold. "It's still hunting you?" "It doesn't like losing its toys. The Shadow Man put a lot of effort into breaking me down, learning exactly which buttons to push. I'm valuable to it now, plus..." He hesitated. "I think I brought something back with me. Some kind of connection to that place. Sometimes I can feel it tugging at the edges of my mind, trying to pull me back." The implications of that were terrifying. If Larry was right, then his escape hadn't really freed him. It had just put him on a longer leash. The temperature in the truck plummeted so fast I thought the heater had broken. 1 second we were sitting in the warmth of the cab, Larry's ragged breathing fogging the windows, and the next it felt like someone had opened a freezer door right behind my neck, the kind of cold that cuts through your jacket and settles in your bones. Larry went rigid in the passenger seat. Not the normal kind of tense. I'd seen plenty of that in combat, but completely motionless, like someone had hit a switch and shut him down. His eyes locked onto something behind me, pupils dilated so wide they looked black. "What is it?" I started to turn around. "Don't!" His voice came out as barely a whisper. "Don't turn around." But I could feel it. The same presence that had been haunting my bedroom for months. That weight that made the air itself feel heavy. My rearview mirror showed nothing but the empty back seat of the truck, but Larry was looking at something I couldn't see. His whole body had started shaking again, worse than when I'd found him on the highway. The shadows behind us began moving. Not the natural shift you get from headlights passing by, but something deliberate. They stretched across the ceiling of the cab like fingers reaching forward, and I could see them in my peripheral vision even though I kept my eyes fixed on Larry's terrified face. "He's here," Larry whispered. "He found me." The darkness wrapped around him like smoke made solid. Thick black tendrils that seemed to pour out of the space between the seats, coiling around his arms and chest. Larry tried to scream but only managed a strangled gasp as the shadows tightened their grip. I lunged across the center console, grabbing for his jacket, his arms, anything I could get my hands on. My fingers closed around the fabric of his sleeve just as the shadows yanked him backward. The force was incredible, like trying to hold on to someone being dragged away by a freight train. "Larry!" He looked at me one last time, mouth open in a silent scream before the darkness pulled him down between the seats. Not physically down, there wasn't enough space for a person to fit there, but into something else, a gap in reality that shouldn't have existed. My grip slipped, the fabric tore, and then he was gone. The cab went silent except for the sound of my own breathing. The cold vanished as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind the normal warmth of the truck's heater. I stared at the empty passenger seat, half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. But the evidence was right there. Dark stains on the vinyl where Larry had been sitting. Wet spots that looked suspiciously like blood. And something metallic glinting on the floor where his feet had been. Dog tags, his dog tags. I picked them up with trembling fingers. Lane Larry J. stamped into the metal along with his service number and blood type. Real, solid, proof that he'd been there, that I hadn't lost my mind completely. My phone buzzed. A text from my neighbor asking if everything was okay. Apparently, I'd been shouting loud enough for her to hear through the walls of her house. I typed back that everything was fine, though my hands shook so badly I had to retype the message twice. I couldn't go home. Not now. The Shadow Man knew where I lived, and if it had just taken Larry, I wasn't going to sit around waiting for it to come back for me. I needed to talk to someone who would understand, who wouldn't immediately suggest I check myself into a psychiatric ward. Roger Knight lived 20 minutes away in a subdivision that had seen better days. Modest ranch houses with small yards and cars that were older but well-maintained. The kind of neighborhood where retired enlisted men ended up when their pensions didn't quite stretch to cover the American dream they'd been promised. I parked in his driveway and sat there for a minute, trying to figure out how to explain what had just happened. Roger had been having his own problems with nightmares lately. He'd mentioned them the last time we'd gotten together for drinks. Dreams about shadows and voices calling his name. I'd thought it was just standard PTSD stuff, the kind we all dealt with to varying degrees. Now I wondered if it was something else entirely. Roger answered the door in sweatpants and a faded army t-shirt, his hair sticking up like he'd been sleeping. He took one look at my face and stepped aside without asking questions. "Coffee?" "Yeah." His kitchen was clean but cluttered, the kind of organized chaos that comes from living alone for too long. Photos of his unit stuck to the refrigerator with magnets, including one of our whole squad from before everything went wrong. Larry was in that picture, grinning at the camera like he didn't have a care in the world. "You look like hell," Roger said, starting the coffee maker. "Something happened tonight." He paused, his hand still on the coffee canister. Roger had always been good at reading people. It was part of what made him such an effective squad leader. He could tell when someone was about to break down or lose it in the field. "The shadow thing?" I nodded. Roger had been the only person I'd told about my bedroom visits. He'd listened without judgment, probably because he'd been having his own encounters. It took someone. The coffee maker gurgled to life while I explained about finding Larry on the highway, about his claims that other soldiers were trapped in some kind of shadow realm. Roger listened without interrupting, his face getting more serious as I described what had happened in the truck. When I showed him the dog tags and the bloodstains on my jacket sleeve, he sat back in his chair and ran a hand through his hair. Jesus, Clifford. I know how it sounds. No, that's just it. It doesn't sound crazy anymore. He got up and pulled a notebook from a kitchen drawer. I've been keeping track of the dreams, dates, details, anything I could remember. They're getting more frequent. The notebook was filled with Roger's precise handwriting. Dates going back 3 months, descriptions of shadow figures, notes about temperature changes, and feelings of being watched. It read like a supernatural incident report. "We need help," I said. "What kind of help? We can't exactly file a police report about shadow monsters." That was the problem. What we were dealing with wasn't something the normal world had procedures for. But I'd been thinking about it during the drive over, and I had an idea. Remember that VA counselor who helped Martinez after his breakdown, Ashlyn Hansen? Roger nodded. "She's good. Doesn't write people off just because they're talking about weird stuff. And there was that intel guy who's been working with veterans on classified exposure cases, Williams, I think. Hayden Williams? Yeah, I've heard of him. Former military intelligence, now he does consultation work for veterans dealing with unusual situations." It felt like a long shot, but it was better than trying to handle this alone. If there were other soldiers trapped in whatever dimension had swallowed Larry, we needed people who could think outside the normal parameters of mental health treatment or standard military protocol. Roger made the calls while I sat at his kitchen table, staring at Larry's dog tags and trying not to think about the expression on his face when the shadows dragged him away. The metallic clink of the tags against each other sounded too loud in the quiet kitchen. Both Ashlyn and Williams agreed to meet with us the next morning. Roger had been deliberately vague about the specifics, just saying we had a situation involving multiple veterans that required their expertise. Professional courtesy got us the appointments that a full explanation might have lost us. "They'll want documentation," Roger said after hanging up the phone. I held up the dog tags and pointed to the bloodstains on my jacket. "We've got evidence." "Evidence of what exactly?" "That something happened, sure. But evidence that it was supernatural shadow monsters? That's a harder sell." He was right, but it was all we had. Whatever was hunting veterans from our unit, it wasn't going to stop with Larry. If Rowan and the others were really trapped somewhere, we needed to find a way to reach them before it came for the rest of us. We met at Harold's apartment the next evening. A cramped 2-bedroom in a complex that had seen better decades. Harold answered the door before I could knock, like he'd been watching through the peephole. His sandy hair looked like he'd been running his hands through it, and his blue eyes kept darting past me to check the hallway. "Come in, quick," he said, stepping aside. The living room felt like mission control for someone who'd lost faith in technology. 3 laptops sat on a folding table, all disconnected from the internet. A stack of printed documents covered most of the coffee table, and Harold had taped sheets of paper to the walls with what looked like timelines and connection diagrams drawn in different colored pens. Larry was already there, sitting stiffly on the edge of the couch like he might need to run. Hayden stood near the window, holding a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. Jade occupied the single armchair, her medical bag at her feet and a notepad balanced on her knee. Knight had claimed the other end of the couch, his massive frame making the furniture look like dollhouse pieces. "This place feels like a bunker," Knight said, looking around at Harold's setup. Good," Harold replied, "because that's what it is." Jade looked up from her notepad. "Before we start, I need to ask something. Has anyone else noticed their cell phones acting up? Dead batteries, weird interference, calls dropping?" I pulled out my phone and checked the battery. 60% when I'd left home 20 minutes ago. Now it showed 38. "Mine's been dying fast too," Larry said quietly. Harold pointed to a small device on his kitchen counter. Faraday cage, blocks all signals in and out. I put my phone in there when I'm home now. That's... Hayden paused, adjusting his glasses. Actually not paranoid at all, given what we're dealing with. Speaking of what we're dealing with, I said, settling into the only remaining chair. Let's start with what everyone's seen. Harold went first, his words coming out in rapid bursts like he'd been rehearsing. He described the same temperature drops Larry and I had experienced, the same electrical failures. But his sightings were different. The shadow had appeared in reflections, bathroom mirrors, car windows, the black screen of his laptop. Always just at the edge of his vision, gone when he turned to look directly. Started about 3 weeks ago, he said, consulting a handwritten calendar on the wall. First time was in my bathroom mirror while I was shaving. Thought it was just fatigue, you know? But then it kept happening. Jade's account was clinical, delivered in the same steady tone she'd probably used to report casualties. She'd seen the shadow twice, both times at the hospital where she worked. Once in the reflection of a medical cabinet's glass door. Once standing at the end of an empty hallway during her night shift. Temperature dropped maybe 15 degrees both times, she said, making notes as she talked. And every electronic device within 20 feet started malfunctioning. Monitors flickered, IV pumps beeped error codes, even the automatic doors stopped working. I'd brought a legal pad and found myself automatically organizing their accounts the way I would a complex audit. Dates, times, locations, environmental factors. The accounting part of my brain loved patterns, and patterns were definitely emerging. Harold, you said first sighting was 3 weeks ago. Jade, what about yours? She flipped back through her notepad. First one was 18 days ago. Second was 6 days ago. I wrote the timeline on my pad, then looked at Larry. When did yours start? Hard to say exactly. The capture was different. But the first time I saw him after getting back, that was 9 days ago. Night had been quiet through all of this, but now he leaned forward. Mine was 4 days ago. Saw him standing in my backyard around 2 in the morning. Thought it was an intruder at first. Grabbed my service weapon. But when I turned on the porch light, nothing there. The pattern hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the dates I'd written down, checking my math twice because that's what accountants do when the numbers look wrong. Guys, I said, my voice coming out hoarser than intended. Look at this spacing. I turned the pad around so everyone could see. Harold, 3 weeks, Jade 2.5 weeks, Larry escaped 9 days ago, Night 4 days, and I've been seeing him for, well, longer than anyone. What are you getting at? Jade asked. The intervals are getting shorter, like it's accelerating. I drew lines between the dates. And if this thing took Rowan and the others in the same sequence... Hayden opened his folder and spread out several sheets on the coffee table. Military personnel records, deployment information, casualty reports. I pulled everything I could access about your unit, cross-referenced with missing person reports, unexplained deaths, anything that might be connected. The documents looked official enough to make me nervous about how Hayden had gotten them, but I wasn't about to ask. He pointed to a list of names with dates next to them. Frankie May and Edwin Rojas died in the original incident. That's confirmed. But look at this. His finger moved down the list. James Wilkins, reported missing from his apartment in Colorado 8 weeks ago. Temperature in his apartment was found to be 40 degrees below the outside air when police investigated. My stomach dropped. 8 weeks ago. Rowan Wang Malley last seen leaving his job in Boston 6 weeks ago. Security cameras showed him walking to his car normally, but the car was found running in the parking garage 3 hours later, no sign of him. 6 weeks, Larry repeated, understanding where this was going. Marcus Chen, found dead in his apartment in Seattle 5 weeks ago. Coroner ruled it natural causes, but the responding officers reported electronic equipment throughout the building had malfunctioned around the time of death. Harold was staring at the timeline, his face pale. It's working through our unit in order. Not order, I said, the pattern crystallizing in my mind with horrible clarity. Reverse order of rank. Junior enlisted first, working up the chain of command. I grabbed Hayden's records and cross-referenced them with my own memories of our unit structure. The dates aligned perfectly with military hierarchy. The entity was systematically eliminating our unit from the bottom up. That puts you at the end of the list, Knight said, looking at me. Yeah, the word came out flat. It does. I spent the next hour documenting everything we'd discussed, organizing the information into categories like I was preparing a financial report. Environmental factors, witness accounts, timeline analysis, pattern identification. The accounting background that everyone had always said was boring suddenly felt like the most important skill I possessed. Every account included the same elements: sudden temperature drops of 10 to 20 degrees, electronic devices failing or behaving erratically, and the shadow appearing just outside direct vision. The timing was consistent too, always between midnight and 4 in the morning, always when the witnesses were alone. We need to involve the authorities, Knight said after I'd finished reading back my summary. FBI, local police, somebody official who can... No. The word came out harder than I'd intended. Remember Gregory Munoz? Knight's expression darkened. That bastard. Exactly. He had all the evidence we could give him about the original incident, and he buried it under combat stress and unreliable witness testimony. You think regular cops are going to take this seriously? But we have documentation now, Jade said. Medical records, missing person reports, multiple witnesses, all describing a shadow that appears in mirrors and makes electronics stop working. I closed my notepad. How do you think that sounds to someone who's never seen what we've seen? The room went quiet. Harold was fidgeting with one of his disconnected laptops, opening and closing it like a nervous habit. Larry looked like he was fighting not to disappear into the couch cushions. So what do we do? Hayden asked. I'd been thinking about this since we'd started gathering accounts. The military had failed us. Official channels had failed us. We needed someone who might actually understand what we were dealing with, someone who wouldn't dismiss us as traumatized veterans seeing things. We need expertise outside military channels, I said. Someone who studies this kind of thing. Paranormal researchers, folklore experts, people who might have encountered something like this before. Like ghost hunters? Harold asked, sounding skeptical. Like academics, anthropologists, historians, maybe religious scholars. People who've made careers studying supernatural phenomena without automatically assuming it's all fake. Knight was shaking his head. Clifford, you're talking about involving civilians in something that's already killed multiple soldiers. I'm talking about finding someone who might know how to fight this thing before it works its way through the rest of us. I looked around the room at faces that had seen too much and survived too little. Because sitting here documenting patterns isn't going to save anyone. The silence that followed felt heavy with the weight of decisions we didn't want to make. But the timeline was clear, and my position on it was clearer. Whatever this thing was, it was coming for me next, and when it did, I wanted to be ready. I called Georgetown University's anthropology department the next morning asking for Professor Holly Grant. The department secretary put me on hold long enough that I started to wonder if I'd gotten the wrong person, but eventually a warm voice came through the line. This is Holly. Professor Grant, my name is Clifford Fisher. I'm a veteran and I need to speak with someone who understands Middle Eastern folklore, specifically about entities that might follow soldiers home. The line went quiet. I could hear papers rustling, then the sound of a door closing. Mr. Fisher, that's quite a specific request. May I ask what prompted it? I'd rehearsed this part. I'm experiencing some unusual phenomena that might be connected to my deployment in Afghanistan. A colleague suggested you might have expertise in this area. I see. Well, I do have office hours tomorrow afternoon. Would 2 o'clock work? Her office was on the 3rd floor of ICC, tucked between the Medieval Studies Department and a cluster of graduate student cubicles. Holly Grant looked exactly like I'd pictured a Georgetown professor, maybe 57, with silver-streaked black hair twisted up in an elegant knot, and intelligent dark eyes behind stylish glasses. She wore a burgundy blazer over a cream blouse with a colorful scarf that looked expensive. Mr. Fisher, please sit. Her office was cramped but organized, bookshelves running floor to ceiling on 3 walls. I recognized some of the languages: Arabic, Farsi, what might have been Aramaic. A few artifacts sat on her desk: a small clay tablet, some kind of bronze amulet, a piece of carved stone. So tell me about these phenomena you're experiencing. I started with the basics: the dreams, the feeling of being watched, the way the shadow man appeared in peripheral vision but never directly. Holly listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. When I mentioned Afghanistan, she leaned forward slightly. Which province? Helmand. We were running convoy security between Lashkar Gah and some of the smaller outposts. And when did these experiences begin? Right after I got back, but they've gotten worse recently. I paused, trying to figure out how much to tell her. There are other veterans from my unit experiencing similar things. Some of them have gone missing. That's when I saw it, the shift Holly's expression. The scholarly curiosity drained out of her face, replaced by something that looked like alarm. She set down her pen and folded her hands on the desk. Mr. Fisher, I need you to describe this entity in as much detail as possible. Everything you can remember. I walked her through it. The way shadows seemed to bend around the figure, how it never appeared in direct light, always at the edges. The crushing weight in my chest whenever it showed up, the way it felt ancient, patient, like it had been waiting a very long time. Holly's face grew more grave with each detail. When I finished, she pulled a thick book from the shelf behind her desk, something written in what looked like Arabic script. What you're describing matches historical accounts of entities the ancient Mesopotamians called the Galu, shadow demons. She flipped through pages covered in dense text and diagrams. They were believed to be malevolent forces that fed on human suffering, particularly the suffering of warriors. The legends say they would attach themselves to soldiers returning from battle, drawn by the trauma and violence they'd witnessed. My hands felt cold. Attach themselves how? Like parasites. They would follow soldiers home, feeding on their fear and guilt until the host was completely drained. Then they would move on to others connected to the same conflict, fellow warriors, family members, anyone who shared that bond of combat. Holly turned the book so I could see the page she'd been reading. The text was incomprehensible to me, but there were illustrations in the margins, dark figures with elongated limbs always drawn in the shadows of doorways or at the edges of torchlight. These entities were particularly drawn to units that had experienced significant trauma. Mass casualties, friendly fire incidents, situations where warriors felt responsible for the deaths of their comrades. The convoy. Frankie and Edwin dying in the blast. Rowan disappearing. The guilt I'd carried for 3 years, wondering if I could have done something different. According to the texts, the Galu could sustain themselves indefinitely, as long as they had access to their chosen victims. But they were also territorial. Once they marked a group of warriors, they would methodically work through them one by one. Is there a way to stop them? Holly flipped to another section of the book. The ancient protective methods involve specific symbols and ritual practices. Salt barriers at thresholds, iron implements, certain geometric patterns drawn with blessed chalk or charcoal. She grabbed a fresh sheet of paper and started sketching. This is a ward symbol. It's meant to create a boundary the entity cannot cross. And this one is for binding, to trap the spirit in a specific location. The symbols looked like nothing I'd seen before, angular lines intersecting in complex patterns with small circles and dots at key points. The texts also mention protective circles made from salt mixed with iron filings placed at every entrance to the dwelling. Windows, doors, even ventilation shafts if the structure has them. I copied the symbols carefully, making sure I got every line and angle right. My handwriting looked clumsy compared to Holly's precise academic script, but the details were all there. Professor, if these things are real, if they've been documented for thousands of years, why doesn't anyone know about them? Holly removed her glasses and cleaned them slowly. Mr. Fisher, there are many things in this world that exist outside the boundaries of what we consider acceptable knowledge. Academic institutions don't generally fund research into supernatural entities. But that doesn't make the experiences any less real for the people who encounter them. She handed me a business card. My direct number is on the back. If you implement these protective measures and see any changes in your situation, I want you to call me immediately. I left Georgetown with a notebook full of symbols and a shopping list I never thought I'd need to make. Hardware store for salt and iron filings, art supply shop for charcoal sticks, a Catholic bookstore for blessed chalk. Though I wasn't sure how I'd explain that purchase. The hardware store was easy enough. The clerk didn't ask why I needed 20 pounds of table salt and a bag of iron filings meant for sandblasting. The art store was straightforward too. Charcoal was charcoal. Whether you were drawing still lifes or warding off ancient demons, the religious bookstore took more finesse. I told the elderly woman behind the counter that I was doing some research on traditional blessing practices. She sold me the chalk without question, even threw in a small pamphlet about home consecration rituals. Back at my apartment, I spread everything out on the kitchen table. Salt, iron filings, charcoal, blessed chalk, and my notebook with Holly's carefully drawn symbols. The whole setup looked like either a very strange art project or the beginning of a mental breakdown. I started with the front door, mixed salt and iron filings in a small bowl, then poured a thin line across the threshold. The mixture felt gritty under my fingers, leaving dark streaks on the hardwood floor. Next came the symbol. I chose the ward design, drawing it on the door itself with the blessed chalk. The lines felt important somehow, like each stroke was building something stronger than just marks on wood. The kitchen window was next, then the bedroom windows, then the sliding door to the balcony. Each threshold got its salt barrier, each entrance got its protective symbol. By the time I finished, my apartment looked like a crime scene mapped out by someone with obsessive-compulsive disorder. The binding symbol went in the center of the living room, drawn directly on the hardwood floor with charcoal. Holly had said this one was for trapping entities in a specific location, though she hadn't been clear about whether that meant keeping them in or keeping them out. I stepped back and looked at my work. The symbols were precise, copied exactly from Holly's drawings. The salt lines were unbroken, running across every possible entry point. If this didn't work, at least I'd know I'd done everything right. Darkness fell earlier than usual, or maybe I just noticed it more. I'd been hyper-aware of shadows all day, watching for any sign that the Shadow Man was getting ready to make another appearance. The apartment felt different now, charged somehow, like the air before a thunderstorm. Around 10 o'clock, I felt the familiar pressure building in my chest. Not the crushing weight I'd experienced before, but something lighter, more frustrated than oppressive. The temperature didn't drop this time, No fog appeared on the windows, but I could sense something moving just outside the boundaries I'd created, testing the edges of the salt lines, pressing against the protective symbols. I sat on the couch, watching the corners of the room where the shadows gathered thickest. The presence was stronger than ever, but it felt contained, held back, like there was an invisible barrier between me and whatever was trying to reach me. The relief was overwhelming. Holly's protections were working. The Shadow Man was still there. I could feel it circling the apartment like a shark around a cage, but it couldn't get through. The ancient symbols and salt barriers were holding. But containment wasn't the same as elimination. The entity was still active, still hunting, and if it couldn't reach me, it would go after the others. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts. Harold answered on the second ring. "Clifford, what's going on?" "I found someone who knows about this thing, a professor at Georgetown who studied entities like the Shadow Man. I need you to listen carefully." I walked Harold through everything Holly had told me. The Umagalu, the way they attached to combat units, the protective measures that could keep them at bay. I could hear him writing things down, asking me to repeat the symbol descriptions. "You need to get these supplies tonight if possible. Salt, iron filings, blessed chalk if you can find it. Draw the symbols exactly like I'm describing them." "Clifford, this sounds insane?" "Yeah, I know. But it's working. The thing is here right now and it can't get through the barriers." Silence on the other end then. "Okay. I'll do it." Jade's number went straight to voicemail. I left a detailed message hoping she'd check it soon. Larry was harder to reach. He was staying at a different motel every night, paying cash, trying to stay ahead of whatever was tracking him. I finally got through to him around midnight. "Clifford, Jesus, I thought..." "Larry, listen to me. I found a way to keep it back. Not to kill it, but to keep it from reaching you." I repeated the same information I'd given Harold, emphasizing the urgency. If the Shadow Man couldn't get to me, it would go after the easier targets. "You need to do this tonight. Don't wait until morning." "Where am I supposed to get blessed chalk at midnight?" "Any Catholic church. Find one that's open, tell them you need it for protection. Most priests have seen enough weird stuff that they won't ask too many questions." After I hung up, I sat back down on the couch and watched the shadows move at the edges of my vision. The protective measures were holding, but I could feel the entity's frustration growing stronger. It had been patient for 3 years, methodically working through its targets. Now that patience was wearing thin. I'd bought us time, but time was all it was. The Shadow Man wasn't going to give up and move on to some other group of veterans. It had marked us, and it would keep coming until it finished what it started. The real question was whether we could figure out how to destroy it before it found a way around our defenses. My apartment had become something between a fortress and a research lab, though neither word really captured what it felt like to live there anymore. Every surface that wasn't covered in salt lines held some piece of the puzzle I'd been trying to solve for weeks now. The coffee table disappeared under stacks of printouts about unexplained disappearances dating back centuries. My kitchen counter turned into a staging area for protective symbols I'd sketched from Holly's recommendations and photos I'd found in obscure academic papers. Sleep came in 3-hour chunks at best. I'd arranged my bed so the headboard touched the wall, giving me a clear view of the entire room. Salt lines ran along every threshold, bedroom door, bathroom door, even the closet. The stuff crunched under my feet when I got up to check the windows, which happened more often than I wanted to admit. But it wasn't the helpless kind of vigilance anymore. I had a system now, routines that made sense. The Shadow Man still came around. I'd catch that familiar drop in temperature or see the streetlight outside my bedroom window dim for no reason, and I'd know he was testing the boundaries again. But instead of lying there frozen, waiting for him to do whatever he wanted, I'd get up and reinforce the salt barriers. Sometimes I'd light the candles Holly had suggested, white ones arranged in a specific pattern she'd copied from a book about Celtic protective rituals. The flames would dance a little too wildly for the still air in my apartment, but they held their ground. 2 weeks ago, I'd woken up to find my bedroom door standing open. The salt line across the threshold had been disturbed, swept aside in a perfect arc like something had pushed through it. My first instinct was the old panic, that crushing weight in my chest that used to leave me gasping for air. Instead, I'd gotten up, cleaned the scattered salt, and laid down a fresh line. Then I'd added a second barrier 3 feet inside the first one, creating a buffer zone. The next night, only the outer line got disturbed. I'd started calling Harold every morning around 8, right after my coffee finished brewing. Jade checked in most evenings, usually while she was walking her dog. The conversations weren't long. None of us felt comfortable staying on the phone too much, but they kept us connected. More importantly, they let us know everyone was still here, still fighting. "Any visitors last night?" became our code for asking about the Shadow Man. Just the usual window shopping meant he'd been around but hadn't tried anything serious. Quiet night meant either he hadn't shown up or our defenses had held him off entirely. We developed the system after Harold mentioned that his apartment had been getting colder at night, even with the heat cranked up. Jade reported shadows in her peripheral vision that moved wrong, like they were walking upright instead of following the objects that should have cast them. Larry's situation was more complicated. He was staying with his sister in Vermont now, trying to get some distance from whatever connection still linked him to that place. But even 300 miles away, he called every few days to report dreams that felt too real, visions of hallways that stretched further than they should. My work performance had gone to hell, which was probably the most normal thing about my life these days. I'd always been the guy who caught other people's mistakes, who could spot a discrepancy in a spreadsheet from across the room. Now I found myself reading the same column of numbers 3 times and still not processing what they meant. My supervisor had started giving me simpler assignments, the kind of busy work they usually handed to new hires. I should have cared more about that, but every morning when I sat down at my desk, all I could think about were the maps waiting for me at home. The research had become my real job. I'd converted my dining room into a command center, pushpins marking locations across 3 different world maps. Red pins for confirmed disappearances that matched our pattern, military personnel, usually combat veterans, vanishing without explanation. Yellow pins for possibles, cases where the details were close but not quite right. Blue pins for related phenomena, places where people reported encounters with shadow figures that didn't result in disappearances. The patterns were starting to emerge. Clusters in areas that had seen heavy military activity, both recent conflicts and older ones. A concentration of cases near former battlefields, especially places where large numbers of soldiers had died. Holly had been right about the historical component. This thing had been hunting warriors for a long time, leaving just enough survivors to spread stories that most people dismissed as folklore. Ancient texts were harder to come by, but I'd managed to track down digital copies of manuscripts that referenced similar entities. Most were in languages I couldn't read, but the illustrations were universal enough. Figures made of living darkness, reaching out of doorways that opened onto nothing. Warriors being pulled into shadows that had no source. Always the same theme, something that fed on the bond between soldiers that grew stronger when it had multiple victims connected by shared experience. The wall above my couch now held photocopies of protective symbols from 6 different cultures. Celtic knots, Nordic runes, symbols from Native American traditions that Holly had helped me identify. I'd drawn them on index cards and taped them up like some kind of occult mood board. Whether they actually worked or just made me feel better, I couldn't say. But the night I'd hung the last one, a Lakota symbol meant to confuse evil spirits, the temperature in my apartment had stabilized for the first time in weeks. My phone buzzed with a text from Jade. "Window shopping again last night, you?" I typed back. "Same. Reinforced the Eastern Barrier." She responded with a thumbs up emoji, which somehow managed to convey both solidarity and dark humor. We'd gotten good at packing a lot of meaning into very few words. The documentation part had become almost meditative. Every night before bed, I'd sit at my kitchen table and write down everything that had happened. Temperature changes, unusual shadows, dreams that felt different from regular nightmares. The notebook was already half full, pages of observations written in my careful handwriting. Some entries were just a line or two. 3:17 a.m., bedroom door rattled for approximately 30 seconds. Others ran for paragraphs, detailed accounts of encounters that left me questioning what I'd actually seen versus what my mind had filled in. Reading back through the entries, I could track the progression. The early pages were full of terror and confusion, fragments of thoughts that barely made sense even to me. But the recent entries read differently. Clinical observations, tactical assessments, the kind of situational reports I used to file after patrol missions. I'd found my footing again, remembered how to be a soldier instead of just a victim. The maps told their own story. What had started as random pushpins scattered across continents had evolved into something that looked almost like a military campaign. Supply lines, if you squinted at them right, staging areas, territories under enemy control. I'd even started color coding by time period, trying to track whether the disappearances followed any kind of seasonal pattern or responded to larger conflicts. Holly had sent me copies of 3 different academic papers about shadow folklore, each one adding another piece to the picture. The entity had different names across cultures: the Dark Hunter, the Void Walker, the one that came for warriors who had seen too much death. But the descriptions matched closely enough that I was convinced we were dealing with the same thing. Something that existed in the spaces between light and dark, that grew stronger by consuming the bond soldiers formed with each other. The worst part was realizing how perfectly we'd set ourselves up for it. Combat units are built on trust, on the kind of connection that keeps you alive when everything else goes to hell. We'd been brothers in every way that mattered, and that had made us exactly what this thing was hunting. It had taken Rowan first because he was our anchor, the guy who kept everyone's head on straight. Then Frankie and Edwin because losing them would destabilize the rest of us. Larry had been meant to disappear next, but somehow he'd fought his way out. Now it was working its way through the survivors, picking us off one by one. Harold was holding steady for now, but Jade had mentioned dreams about desert highways that stretched too far. And Larry's sister had called me directly last week to say she was worried about him. The thing was still connected to all of us, still pulling at whatever threads linked us to that convoy and to each other. But I wasn't the same person who'd woken up terrified in his own bedroom 6 weeks ago. The apartment around me proved that. Salt barriers that actually worked, research that was starting to make sense, a support network that kept us all fighting instead of just surviving. When the lights flickered now, I didn't freeze up waiting for something terrible to happen. I grabbed my flashlight and reinforced whichever barrier looked like it needed attention. This was war, just not the kind I'd trained for. No uniforms, no clear rules of engagement, no backup coming if things went sideways, but it was still war. And I still remembered how to fight. The enemy had followed me home from a desert road where my friends had died, wearing a form I'd never imagined in my worst nightmares. It had taken my squad, trapped them somewhere I couldn't reach, and now it wanted to finish what it had started. The difference was that now I understood what I was up against. Every symbol on my walls, every salt line on my floor, every phone call with the other survivors was a small victory in a campaign that might take years to win. I wasn't just defending myself anymore, I was building something that could protect all of us, that might even find a way to get Rowan and the others back. When the temperature in my apartment dropped 15 degrees in the space of 10 seconds, I didn't panic. I got up, checked my barriers, and waited for the cold to pass. The Shadow Man could test my defenses all he wanted. I'd keep strengthening them until I found a way to take the fight to him instead of just holding ground.